monthly meeting. Personally, I have been looking forward to this meeting ever since the monthly program committee began talking about a presentation that would highlight and celebrate one of Michigan's most beautiful and spectacular places along our western shoreline. I hope you are ready with me to take the whirlwind tour of Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore by looking back at its history and development and looking forward to what the future might be for this Michigan treasure. If you grew up in Michigan or have lived in the state for several years, you most likely have been to Sleeping Bear Dunes, perhaps several times. However, if you have not been there, you will definitely want to visit after today's presentation. I know that many of you have spoken to me and mentioned how much you're missing the social aspect of HASP. So I know that you're anxiously looking at all the plans that are being made for our very first Zoom Fall Fling Trivia Night, which is being presented by our Special Events Committee. The committee has worked extremely hard and diligently to put this event together. You can check the October newsletter for more details, and you should have received a constant contact in the last couple of days with information for signing up. There will also be a couple more constant contact reminders coming our way before the event, which is scheduled for October 27 at 7 p.m. in the evening. Our fall curriculum term is off to a great start. We hope that you have been attending all your selected classes without technical problems and have been able to engage in positive ways during the Q&A portions of the class. Here's one more reminder for you. You can register for classes throughout the term. However, we do ask that you register at least 24 hours in advance of the scheduled class time. This will enable the staff to make sure that you are properly enrolled and will be admitted into the virtual classroom. I know that you know this, but you must be registered for each course in order to be admitted. Looking ahead, the curriculum subcommittees are in the midst of planning for the winter-spring 2021 term, which will include a focus on diversity, racism, and inclusion. They are eager for course and presenter ideas for any and all areas of our curriculum. If you have suggestions, please email them to our curriculum chairperson, Sharon Aronshorst. Finally, I want to share with you that the HASP board has established a COVID subcommittee whose primary goal will be to make plans that will include guidelines and recommendations for our own organization as we move into 2021. All guidelines and recommendations from both the state and Hope College will have to be taken into consideration together with information and data which will be available at a given time. Please know that our decisions and plans will continue to have you, our members, as the priority in terms of safety and health concerns. I will keep you up to date as plans are developed, and please watch the newsletter for any important messages in this regard. And now Carla Verskure, our chairperson of membership, will introduce today's guests and new members. Carla?
Thank you, Barbara. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you with us this morning. We would like to give a special HASP welcome to 4 guests with us. We're so glad that Bert and Marlene Brownius and Mary Jo and Russ Kiefer could join us this morning. We wish we could meet you in person, but we'll give you a HASP wave or a thumbs up. It's also my pleasure to introduce 7 new members and 1 reinstated member. So join me as we introduce George and Sibylla Borgter, Lori Goshorn, Laura Judge, Deborah and Joe Salinas, and Sue Watson as new members, and welcome back Marie Pedersen as a reinstated member. We're so happy to have all of you join us, and the day will come when we can meet in person. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla, and welcome to both our guests and all our new members. That's a great list this morning to have. Welcome all. Next, Director Kim Mendels will share a few instructions with us regarding this morning's presentation, and that will be followed by the introduction of our speaker this morning by member of our monthly program committee, Paul Trapp. Thank you very much.
Morning, everybody, and welcome to our new members. I can't wait to meet you all in person. Very excited for this program this morning, as Sleeping Bear Dunes in Northern Michigan is near and dear to my heart, so welcome. To provide the best experience for us this morning with this many people on the call, I'm just going to ask for you, when you have a comment or a question, to use the chat option, which is sort of in the middle of your toolbar for Zoom. Looks like a little cartoon box. I just need you to click on that and then send your comments or questions to me so that I can share those with the speaker. And when I say me, you will see the orange box that says HASP Virtual Classroom Host. You want to send that question to me. So you just click on my name, which is HASP Virtual Classroom, to send those questions directly to me. And I will share those with Scott while he is giving his presentation to us this morning. Finally, if you do not have your screen and speaker view, we recommend that for the quality of the presentation. So that is in generally the top right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, and there's an option that says speaker view. That way, when Scott is speaking, you will primarily see him and his PowerPoint slide, as opposed to the grid of the 150 or so people who are here. We're glad that you're here with us, and I'm gonna turn it back to Barb. Thanks.
We'll just go right to, whoops. We'll just going right to Paul, and he can introduce our speaker this morning.
Okay. Am I on?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Paul Trapp. As a former seasonal national park ranger and having family members in the Park Service, I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker. Scott Tucker, Superintendent of Sleeping Bear National Lakeshore, a 70,000-acre sanctuary along the shore of Lake Michigan. Scott is a Colorado native, a graduate of the University of Northern Colorado. Before joining the Park Service, he worked as visitor service manager at the Smithsonian's Museum of the American Indian, including when he was there for the grand opening. At the start of his 23-year National Park Service career, he managed the President's Park in Washington, D.C., 54 acres surrounding the White House. Before moving to Michigan with his wife and 2 children, Scott served as superintendent of the Lewis and Clark National Historic Park on the Pacific Coast. He came to the Better Coast, becoming superintendent of the Sleeping Bear National Lakeshore in 2016. As many of us remember, the establishment of this park was controversial, but over time it has become recognized as a real treasure. And in the past 4 years, Scott has been very successful in building closer ties with local communities and with the park's friendship group. Now he can share his insights and experiences as he brings us a broader understanding of this special natural and historic place right here in Western Michigan. Scott Tucker.
Hey, good morning. Thank you, Paul, and everybody for letting me join you today. I'm going to try to share a screen here in just a second. We'll see if this works. I'm going to hit that button, and I'm going to hit this button, and I'm going to hit this button. All right. Can someone give me a thumbs up if you see a great big bear?
You're good. You're good. It looks great, Scott. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, hey, good morning, everybody. And Paul, thank you for the introduction. As Kim mentioned, Sleeping Bear Dunes is celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. So our new theme is 51 is the new 50 after a summer of chaos and craziness. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Paul stole my thunder with that image. I don't often get to use my grand vista behind the image here because usually I get to talk in public rather than on screens. But as mentioned, I've been here in Sleeping Bear since 2016. I started my National Park Service career in the mid-90s at a small historical park in Alaska at Klondike Gold Rush National Historic Park. One of the great things about being a park ranger is they are all in amazing places. My Park Service career has taken me from Alaska to Washington, D.C., along the Lewis and Clark Trail, across the Midwest to the Oregon coast, and then, as Paul said, to the right coast here in northern Michigan. Unlike military, we get to pick where we want to go. And so when Sleeping Bear came up, it was definitely a job that I wanted to compete for numerous reasons. I had been here before. My wife is from downstate. My bonus mother-in-law is a Hope alum. And one of the reasons to come to Michigan, not only because of spectacular fall days like today where it's 50 degrees and crisp out with beautiful foliage, to get a little bit closer to Grandpa for my two kids. And so for my kids, they think being a national park kid's pretty great as well because they grow up in these places just like I did. I grew up in Colorado, and my family vacations were through the American Southwest, through Yellowstone, through Grand Tetons, through Rocky Mountain National Park. And it was actually on a ranger program my senior year in college at Mesa Verde National Park. And I wish I remember that ranger's name today, that I made the decision not to become a teacher in the classroom for high school social studies, but to be a teacher in the outdoors. And I made a very quick pivot, spring break my senior year after going on a ranger program. And luckily, the very first Park Service job I applied for, I received, and that was in Skagway, Alaska. From there, I found myself in Washington, D.C. As Paul mentioned, I was a park ranger on the National Mall. So with a history geek, what better place to land than to tell the story of America on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, in the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. My favorite, the Korean War Memorial. And so I spent several years in Washington before I hit the road, and I traveled in 2003 with what was called the Corps of Discovery 2. 200 years to the day, we followed the Lewis and Clark Trail with a traveling exhibit. And so wherever Lewis and Clark was, wherever they were in 1803, we were in 2003. Pretty exciting journey, to say the least. Returning to Washington, I became the first manager of visitor services for the National Museum of the American Indian. And so that was one of the spots where I left the Park Service. I called it just another park with air conditioning, where I spent 5 years. After the American Indian Museum, I moved back to the Park Service, and I was the park manager, superintendent of President's Park. And so I managed National Park Service operations at the White House. So all the spots you see in the news today, I'm very glad I am in northern Michigan rather than managing in DC. We made, my family and I made the move as far as possible from Washington on mainland US. There's only one national park in the continental United States that was further than Lewis and Clark National Historical Park in Astoria, Oregon, where we spent 3 years before landing here in Michigan. So really excited to be here. And I think I will tell you, as many of you from the area have been to Sleeping Bear, you've seen the amazing views like the image on the screen. Hopefully I'm going to give you a little bit behind the scenes of things that you did not know were here, or you've only scratched the surface on your visits. The Park Service as a whole got a great idea to come to the Great Lakes in the 1950s. But if we go back 100 years, the National Park Service was created in 1916 to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources of the system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of future generations. And so all of that means my goal here at Sleeping Bear is that in 50 years, Sleeping Bear will be recognizable as you know it today, and your great-great-grandchildren can have the same experiences that you did when they come. And so that's kind of the goal across the system, to preserve these places for all to enjoy. And so in the 1950s, as the National Park Service was getting ready to celebrate its 50th anniversary, they set out across the country to find stories that were not told. Today, there are 421 national park sites across the country. Everything from the Yellowstones and the Yosemites to Sleeping Bear Dunes to Lewis and Clark National Historical Park on the Oregon coast to Thaddeus Cusco, the smallest national park unit in Philadelphia. Last week, Mill Springs National Battlefield Monument was created as the newest national park site, number 421 in Kentucky. But in the 1950s, as the Park Service was getting ready to celebrate its 50th anniversary, they set out across the country with the drive to find what stories were not told. And they came to the Great Lakes. And as they came to the Great Lakes, they found a lot of stories that were not told yet. And so that's where the Sleeping Bear story begins. If you look at today, 2020, national park sites in our great state, Sleeping Bear Dunes, of course, is the best. There's that little one called Isle Royale up in the north. There's Keweenaw National Historical Park up in the UP. Pictured Rocks, River Raisin National Battlefield just south of Detroit. The North Country Trail, 4,500 miles from, which soon will be Vermont to North Dakota, longer than the Appalachian Trail, is headquartered just outside of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And Motor Cities National Heritage Area, that's one that's not often seen. And so if we're sitting here in Michigan, the Motor Cities National Heritage Area is headquartered in Detroit, and it tells the story of the automobile in the state of Michigan. Not your typical national park site. A national heritage area focuses on community museums and a community voice with support from the National Park Service. So there are your national park sites in Michigan. As I said, from north to south, we have a few other parks surrounding us, of course. We have Pullman in Chicago, Indiana Dunes National Park in Indiana, and Perry's Victory Mound out in the middle of Lake Erie. In 2019, 2.7 million park visitors visited national park sites in the state of Michigan. That was 2.7 million. And in theory, they spent $232 million in local gateway regions visiting these sites. So not only were parks back in 1916 created for the future, they're also an economic driver for local communities. Sleeping Bear, as many of you have visited, almost 7,200 acres, 3 units. We have the island unit of North and South Manitou Island. We have the North unit, which encompasses the great things like the Dune Climb, the Pier Stocking Drive, surrounding portions of Big Glen Lake, the Port Oneida Historic District, and then our South unit down towards the Platte River. 65 miles of shoreline. Of that, 3,500 acres are designated as federal wilderness, protected even more than a national park designation. And so the park we know today started in the 50s with that shoreline survey, where the National Park Service looked across the country to find stories that were not told. And the stories that were not told and protected on the Great Lakes. Apostle Islands just celebrated their 50th anniversary last week. Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore, Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore were all the result of this shoreline survey of 1958. From 59 to 70 was a very contentious and controversial time of trying to get legislation passed to create our lakeshore. One of the biggest challenges and challenges of the time, if you think about a national park like a Yellowstone, which was created in 1976 from public land, very easy to say, here's the new boundary of Yellowstone. Sleeping Bear Dunes in 1960 had over 1,500 private inholders owning land within the lakeshore. And so 1,500 families had a story to tell as the legislation was being created. Negotiations happened over that 10-year period before the park's creation in 1970. October 21st, so we're just a week off from that. The enabling legislation of Sleeping Bear Dunes, I'm just going to read it to you off my screen here because it's a mouthful. To preserve the outstanding natural features, including the forests, the beaches, dune formations, ancient glacial phenomena in their natural setting, and to protect them from developments and uses that would destroy their scenic beauty, natural character of the area for the benefit, inspiration, education, recreation, and enjoyment of the public. Very similar to that 1916 National Park Service mission. Sleeping Bear Dunes was created so that the Sleeping Bear Dunes in 1970 would be here in 2020. I think anybody in Michigan knows the buildup of the western shore of Lake Michigan. And if Sleeping Bear Dunes was not created in 1970, what access would we have to this glacial phenomena and historic area that tells so many stories of the state of Michigan? I'm going to try something here and see if this will play for me. So if you think about Sleeping Bear Dunes, in last year, so remember I said last year 2.7 million visitors visited National Park Service sites in Michigan. 1.6 million of those came to Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. And in theory, they spent and supported over 2,300 jobs in the local community with a benefit of local economy. So just to throw some numbers at you, the importance of national parks to the local community. And one of the things Paul said at the beginning was one of my goals when I arrived here in 2016 was to take our community relationships to the next step. If you look at parks that were created 50, 60, 70 years ago, they were kind of thrust upon communities, especially even here at Sleeping Bear. we had a community group that was actually congressionally chartered in Sleeping Bear in 1972, and it was called the Citizens Council for Sleeping Bear. And that congressionally chartered group was filled with appointments from the governor of the state of Michigan and the Secretary of Interior. And that community group was the watchdog of Sleeping Bear for landowner rights within the National Lakeshore. Remember, I said there were 1,500 inholders within the Lakeshore. Today, there are just over 100. So over the last 50 years, we have gone through a process of purchasing over 1,400 private properties from in the Lakeshore. Some of those were condemned. Some of those were life estates. Some of those are willing sellers. But the Citizens Council was created in 1972 to be the watchdog of the park and look out for inholder rights. 2 years ago, that Citizens Council, which was still in existence as a nonprofit, made the decision to make a giant shift in their community relationship from park watchdog to gateway community champion. And so the Citizens Council has made a shift after 50 years to focusing on the gateway communities and helping them manage the visitors that are coming to this region. 1.6 million visitors in 2019, 2020, a crazy year for everyone, including, you know, everybody on this call. We had over 1 million visitors in the month of July and August, the busiest summer in our 50-year existence. And so if we think about it, if we think about one of the goals in 1970 was to create a lakeshore and a place for public to have access to and to recreate. In the summer of 2020, we had over 1 million people recreating in the lakeshore because, well, it was the thing to do. You couldn't go to the movies, you couldn't go to ball games, you couldn't go do the things you normally wanted to do, but guess what? You could go outside. 72,000 acres of Sleeping Bear made that a piece, made that an opportunity. So before I jump into a couple pieces of where we're going, where we've been, Kim, I'll pitch it to you if there's any questions. And I am not hearing anything from you, Kim. So maybe I'm talking to myself right now. Well, then I'm just going to keep rolling and assume that someone can hear me.
Scott, this is Claudia, and I haven't seen any questions in the chat room yet, so.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm back. I had to answer another question. I do have two, actually. One quick, Scott, is if there was a question if there are any trails at Sleeping Bear that are accessible to disabled people.
There are accessible trails. I'm actually talking about that here in just a few minutes.
Great, thanks. Also wondered what the minimum age of park rangers are and also maximum age, as we may have some retirees interested in becoming park rangers.
Great question. The oldest park ranger that I'm aware of right now is just turned 99, and she is a park ranger at Rosie the Riveter National Historical Park in the Bay Area, where she actually was Rosie during World War II. The youngest, we have volunteers that start at, in their teens, 12, 13, 14. There's great youth programs within the National Park Service called the Youth Conservation Corps that brings in high school students age 16, 17 to start their Park Service career. And so it's a wide gamut of young volunteers. My kids have volunteered in national parks that I've worked in, as well as up to 99 still going. So great opportunities. There's a large contingent of retired volunteers as well as rangers. So there's sort of two big summer pushes. So Sleeping Bear itself, I have approximately 50 permanent rangers and staff that work year round. I hire another 100 in the summer. And that's everything from biologists to carpenters to park rangers that interact with the public. those park rangers that interact with the public are a good conglomeration of second career retirees that are looking for a 3-4 month gig in the summer, to high school grads, to everything in between. So great opportunities across the gamut for the Park Service. Before I go way in depth, I always like to acknowledge that Sleeping Bear is just one piece of the story on the lands here in Michigan, and that we are on historic tribal lands. Any project that we do within the Lakeshore, we consult with 5 tribes of Michigan that have traditional use of the Sleeping Bear area. We consult with the Bay Mills Indian community up out of the UP, the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa, the Little Traverse Band of Ottawa, the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa, and the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians. Any project that we do, we consult with those tribes to make sure that we are respecting the land and respecting their historical connection to Sleeping Bear. So I always like to put that in as a piece. And I'm going the wrong way, I apologize. You see that video again. So Sleeping Bear was created, of course, because of the amazing glacial phenomena. Anyone who has stood on the number 9 overlook, overlooking Lake Michigan from 500 feet, 450 to 500 feet above Lake Michigan, knows the awe. And I can bring visitors and friends to this area that have never stepped foot, and we can walk out onto the dune plateau, and they will have that awestruck look, the same one they have when they're looking over the Grand Canyon. This area was created by nature and forces of nature. 10 to 14,000 years ago, the last ice sheets came through this area and carved out what we know today as Sleeping Bear Dunes. Underneath these 450-foot dunes are headlands and moraines from earlier glacial ice lobes that made their way here. Prevailing winds across the Great Lakes and across Lake Michigan take a handful at a time of sand from the lake up and on the dune and over the bluff. And so Sleeping Bear is always growing, always changing. Our challenge is how we manage those changes so that nature wins, in a sense. This bottom image on the left of the forest is one of my favorite images, and of course it does not put it into perspective. This is actually a glacial phenomena called a kettle, and there's a little itty bitty ranger all the way at the bottom of this kettle. This is about a 150 foot straight down, very similar to that dune climb angle and that angle off of Lake Michigan. This is a chunk of an ice of a glacier that broke off and just sat here and melted and depressed the land. We have these glacial kettles throughout the lakeshore, which have no entry, no exit point for the water, and they are just giant craters that tell the story of nature being the boss. And I'll talk a little bit about challenges that we're facing as we come into the years. Nature and the geology is ever changing, and the geology of Sleeping Bear Dunes has dictated where we are going. And where we're going is all over the place throughout the lakeshore. There are over 110 miles of hiking and biking trail within the lakeshore. We have 12 miles of rivers and streams. We have 26 inland lakes. We have 350 campsites. We have a way for anybody to interact with the lakeshore in a way that they want to. And so the question about accessibility, one of the projects that we've instituted over the last few years, we have put in handicap accessible kayak launches so that somebody that needs assistance getting into a kayak can go from wheelchair to kayak to lake without getting their feet wet. Doesn't even have to be a wheelchair. It could be anybody that wants, I use it. where I can get down on a seat, slide over into a kayak, and recreate. As I said, 110 miles of hiking trail. We have the Sleeping Bear Heritage Trail, which is 20 miles paved multi-use trail that gives visitors the opportunity to get to places in the park they never would have been able to get to before. We have Friends of Sleeping Bear Dunes, which is our friends group. They kicked off a track chair program last summer where they actually purchased a outdoor wheelchair that pretty much has rubberized tank tracks that can traverse snow and sand. And a visitor can make an appointment with them and go out with a volunteer on trails of the lakeshore that they would never have the opportunity to step foot on before. We've also used that track chair for winter snowshoe programs with school groups. On a normal winter, we'll have 3,000 to 4,000 local fourth graders, actually not local, across the state fourth graders go on snowshoe education programs with us. And last winter, we actually were able to pull the track chair out and put a student that was in a wheelchair out on the snow with their fellow students. So lots of great things coming out of the Accessibility Committee with Friends of Sleeping Bear. They've also funded ADA walkways, so visitors with mobility challenges can make their way to the beaches and dip their toes in the lake. And I believe next summer they're working on an wheelchair-assisted bicycle, an electric bike that has a wheelchair that snaps on the front of it, that the rider can then ride somebody and give them a tour of the Sleeping Bear Heritage Trail. And then when they park the bike, a couple pins pop out and then the chair is able to move across the landscape as well. So lots of fun ways for visitors to set their feet in Sleeping Bear in one way or another. Popular things, of course, tubing, kayaking, camping, hiking. My kid's favorite, of course, is sledding down the dune climb, where I think my GoPro tracked my 13-year-old son going, I think, 35 miles an hour down the dune last summer in his unicorn inner tube. The other piece of Sleeping Bear, we have, of course, glacial phenomena. We have recreation, which is easy for folks to see. There's a whole nother piece of Sleeping Bear that excites me and excites visitors that have never been here before. There is a history of the lakeshore that when this area was preserved, on all pamphlets, propaganda, it was preserved on the visual stunningness. The visual stunningness, that's a great word. The visual beauty of the lakeshore, which we all know. But there's a whole nother piece of the lakeshore. There is, of course, a tribal history of the Anishinaabe in the area. There is a shipping history. There is a logging history. There is a farming history. And there is a cottage vacation history here at Sleeping Bear. And so for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these pieces that make up the story of us. We have a great connection to maritime history. We have one of the most amazing maritime stories of the Great Lakes. In 1876, over 214 people lost their lives in shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. Coming out of that was the creation of lighthouses, as well as United States Life-Saving Service stations. And we have 3 historic United States Life-Saving Service stations within Sleeping Bear. The only rule if you were in the Life-Saving Service is you had to go out, but you didn't have to come back. And so if you come to Sleeping Bear, you can immerse yourself in 1800 maritime history. The United States Life-Saving Service was folded into the Coast Guard. But if you visit South Manitou Island, you can visit the South Manitou Light, built in 1871. We do education and interpretive programs of what it is like to rescue someone from the Great Lakes back in the 1870s. Great opportunities to engulf yourself in the history of the Great Lakes as this great shipping channel from Chicago through the Straits of Mackinac down into really the St. Lawrence Seaway, a super highway. If you were in Chicago You could fill your ship with cordwood, and the perfect spot to stop for a refuel was Sleeping Bear Bay at Sleeping Bear Dunes at the time. Once we get out of our shipping and maritime history, we have an amazing farming history as well. We have within Sleeping Bear Dunes the Port Oneida Rural Agricultural Historic District, which is the largest rural agricultural district protected in the national park system, with over, actually within the federal government, with over 4,500 acres preserving 17 farmsteads. And so if you were in Michigan at the turn of the century, first it was a super highway. We were a stop to get to Chicago or a stop to get to Mackinac Island. After ships turned to coal, the residents of this area had to shift, and they shifted into an agricultural community. From apple orchards to potato fields, we have over 369 historic structures within Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. Everything from historic cemeteries, historic farms, these life-saving stations. Perfect time right now, apple picking. You can come pick a bushel of apples a day in Sleeping Bear Dunes. As I said, 18 farmsteads, which means 18 farms that had apple orchards, still live today and producing. Once you get out of the farming era, you get into an era of how are we going to bring visitors to this area? And we had a guy named D.H. Day who created the Glen Haven area, which I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth in a few. He started out as a lumberman. When everything was clear cut, he then went to canning and created a general store, created a historic village that is still here in Sleeping Bear today, where you can get 1920s candy as you visit the Glen Haven Canning Center. One of our goals is not only to preserve the natural resources, but to preserve these cultural resources. So the stories of how this area was settled can be told for years to come. And I know I'm just breezing over Sleeping Bear because there are so many things to talk about. So if you have questions, I will come back to those here in a few minutes. Biodiversity-wise, so we've talked about the glacial phenomenon. We talked a little bit about the history, enough to tease everyone to want to come back. We also have incredible biodiversity. There are 908 plant species found in Sleeping Bear Dunes. There are 246 different bird species that can be found here. The natural resources and the reason for protecting Sleeping Bear was specifically to protect the natural resources and this phenomena so that it can be viewed and seen forever. We all can imagine what this shoreline of Sleeping Bear would look like today if the lakeshore wasn't here. McMansion after McMansion, private access after private access. And we would not be able to say that we are one of the premier protectors of two critically endangered species in Lake Michigan. One is the piping plover. In 1986, it was placed on the endangered species list. At one point, there were over 800 breeding pairs of the Great Lakes piping plover on the Great Lakes. This summer, we had 30 pairs in Sleeping Bear Dune and approximately 60 pairs across the Great Lakes. By 1986, there were fewer than 16 breeding pairs. So there were 32 piping plovers, Great Lakes piping plovers in existence in 1986. This year, 30 pairs were here in Sleeping Bear, 65 were across the state. The goal of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service is to have a population of 150 breeding pairs. And so a big chunk of our energy goes into maintaining habitat for the piping plovers. They love the beach, they love the rocky soil, and they also have predators as well as high water. So one of the challenges this summer with our piping plover population is Lake Michigan high water. We actually removed 29, I believe, piping plover eggs before a storm back in June. And those eggs were incubated and then hatched and released back in the park late summer. So piping plovers, if we get down to the root of why we're here, we are here to protect some of these natural resources as well as landscapes for the piping plover. The other real interesting species that we are tasked with is the pictured thistle, which is in this bottom left corner. Pictured thistle, if you jumped out of an airplane and didn't know where you were and you landed in the Great Lakes, if you saw a pictured thistle, you'd be able to tell where you are. The pictured thistle is only found in the Great Lakes, nowhere else in the world. Tricky plant. It takes 5 to 8 years for them to reproduce. It takes 5 to 8 years before they will flower and create new seed. 30 species of insects feast upon the pollen of the pictured thistle. So it is tied to the community and to the environment. And most of those are bees. Bees love pictured thistle. That is also an endangered species placed on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife endangered list in 1988. And so 2 critical places, both the decline in pictured thistle and the decline in piping plovers have 100% to do with development and people removing beach access in sandy areas for these great species. So that's 2 of the success stories of Sleeping Bear Dunes. But as we look at a little bit of why the Lakeshore was here, I'm going to talk a little bit about what our challenges are. And just doing a quick check on time. Our challenges for the next century: responding to climate change, preservation of these landscapes, and responding to our increased visitation. Managing environmental impacts. This summer alone, lots of high water issues, but they've been around for a few years. If you were out at South Manitou Island, Lake Michigan, high water, the water table actually flooded the historic village out on South Manitou Island. In the right corner is a windstorm from 2015 that took down thousands of trees with 100-mile-an-hour straight line winds. Climate change on the Great Lakes, as many of you know, is a little different than any other area of the country. Every area has their unique challenges. The challenges of Sleeping Bear when it comes to climate change are more intense, more frequent storms. And with more intense and more frequent storms, we are seeing environmental issues. As we know, Lake Michigan is its highest point right now. We can see that there is no beach in this top left corner, and that is a combination of high water and heavy storms this last winter. If you look in the bottom left corner, this overlook we actually pulled out last February before it went into Lake Michigan. When I arrived 2 years ago, that overlook was about 45 feet from the lake. In one day, we lost 15 feet of shoreline of one big storm last winter. And that was because Lake Michigan didn't freeze over. Other challenges we have, natural resource-wise, is warmer water and invasive species. And so one of the pieces that we are successful at being as a national park, and so one of the other reasons national parks are created is we become labs. We become an opportunity to see what changes happen over time in a controlled environment. We know that zebra mussels made their way into the Great Lakes. We know that they clarified the water, letting more sun to the bottom to grow algae. We know the Great Lakes water temperatures this summer was the warmest water temperatures in July in years. We had the highest water since recorded in 1916. So the zebra mussels have created the same algal problems here in Sleeping Bear as they do in Lake Erie and other inland lakes across the state. But it is a circle of life that we have a lab of that we can monitor and mitigate. Zebra mussels create clarity of water, as I said, which then gives the algae a chance to grow, which then the round goby, which are invasive fish, then they eat the algae. Then the seabirds and the lake birds eat the fish, and they then get toxic pathogens. They pass away, they wash ashore, and the shore animals then eat those same pathogens. And it's a pretty vicious cycle. And so that's one of our challenges here is managing wildlife. In the fall, we will pick up 2 to 3 to 4 to 500 dead birds along the Sleeping Bear shoreline and monitor them for toxic algae. The other challenges we have with increased storms, I mentioned that 2015 storm that took out thousands of trees. It also wreaks havoc on our historic landscapes. And I know this isn't the best image for you to look at unless you have really squinty eyes like I do right now. The top image is what the D.H. Day Glenhaven Village looked like in 1900. You can see 36 buildings. You can see tree-lined roadways. You can see a curling rink. You can see warehouses, a blacksmith shop, a dock, cannery. If you look at the bottom, the red is all that is gone. And so we don't have any of those red items back in this historic landscape today to tell you what Glenhaven looked like in the turn of the century. And that same windstorm that took out thousands of trees in our forest took down the historic pathway into Glenhaven. Our challenge now is how do we put back this historic landscape to preserve that story of Glenhaven as a tourist mecca in the turn of the century. One of the ways we're going to do it is the Sleeping Bear Inn. Right at the mouth of 109, right on Sleeping Bear Bay, is an inn that opened up in 1857, serving both seagoing passengers off of ships coming from Chicago or going to Chicago, or to tourist rooms here in the 1920s in the bottom corner. We just signed a letter of intent with a nonprofit that is going to restore the Sleeping Bear Inn and hopefully in 2022 open up the 19 rooms to visitors to once again stay within the Lakeshore. And so adaptive reuse of some of these historic structures is one of the ways that we're preserving the Lakeshore for the future. The other challenge we have of, I said 369 historic structures. We have 1.5 million visitors that all like to go to the same place. And so one of the challenges that we're looking at is how do we manage 1.5 to 1.7 million visitors to the Lakeshore. The dune climb in that top left image, we have about 300 people at a public, we have about 3,000 people at a public concert at the dune climb. This image at the top with about 35 people hiking, this was taken in the end of March this year, right when all the orders came out for social distancing. Everybody flocked to Sleeping Bear Dunes. Roads are lined with vehicles. Visitors are doing what visitors do on the Platte River. What one time was a lazy float with you and your canoe or a tube is now a float with 500 to 1,000 of your closest friends. And so challenges that we're looking at into the future is how are we going to preserve this place so that your grandchildren can come and experience Sleeping Bear the same way that you are today. One of our ways of doing that is trying to find not the hidden gems, but provide opportunities for visitors to do something else. Everyone's going to want to come to the dune climb. Folks come and they float the Platte River every year, but there are 100 other miles of trails and activities you can do in this region. 4th of July this year was the busiest 4th of July that anybody could remember. I went out on the beach with my family just south of Platte Point, and I had a mile in every direction to myself. Yet a mile up, there were 3,000 people on their inner tubes. So our challenges in the Lakeshore is how do we provide opportunities in all these other areas and encourage visitors to go to places they've never experienced before. And one of those ways is by highlighting the cultural history that we talked about today, letting them know they can go to the Port Oneida Historic District and spend an entire day at Sleeping Bear and learn something they never knew was possible. They can spend it at the Coast Guard station down at Glenhaven. They can spend it on miles of trails that they've never set foot on. And so those are our challenges as we go to the future is how do we make sure Sleeping Bear is here and for our 100th anniversary, hey, let alone our 200th anniversary. And so the great thing about national parks are we are here to stay. We are in the forever business. If we don't get it right today, hopefully we can fix it tomorrow. But our goal is to make it an opportunity that Sleeping Bear will be here for years to come. So that is your whirlwind. I know I didn't get anything super in depth. I could probably talk for hours. So, you know, next time maybe we do an on-site when things clear up, and I'll take 100 folks on a day trip through Sleeping Bear. But I will open it up to questions for anybody that I did not get anything in depth that you really wanted to hear.
Okay, thank you so much, Scott. I have a couple. You sort of addressed it just in the last couple of minutes, but there was a question about what shoreline erosion issues Sleeping Bear Dunes is facing, as well as if there's concern about erosion caused by all the dune climbers.
Yeah, good question. So shoreline erosion, yeah. Where most folks, if you have private property, folks are looking at how to protect their private property. We're a little different shift. We are, how do we let nature do its thing? And so we, as an example, we removed a deck rather than try to armor that deck. We'll figure out how to get a deck back in that area in the future if we need to. We do, you know, it's almost, if you look at historic photos of the dune climb, if you look at photos from the 70s, it was kind of a rounded peak at the top of the dune climb. Today, it's almost kind of a little depression of a bowl from visitors, foot traffic causing more erosion than was ever there before. It's almost like it's like the sacrificial dune. We have a couple areas in the park where they've been sacrificed to preserve the rest. And so we try to focus some of that active recreation on the dune climb rather than the dune plateau, so that that foot traffic does not impede on the beach grass in the natural process of reclamation. And so there's a, you know, I'm going to back up here to an image. You know, so here's the dune climb. You can see a little more of a hump at the top, more vegetation to either side. Here's a photo in the 70s, 60s, probably late 60s, where that has already been widened. And today it's very similar, where we have the sacrificial areas of the park that will allow us to preserve everything else, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Another question regarding with your perspective on both purchase of land for parks and managing the parks. What thoughts you have about Michigan Proposal 20-1? The Sierra Club is against, while many conservation groups are pro this constitutional amendment.
And forgive me, this is the one about sand mining?
Question is from Don, so I'm not sure.
I have it here.
Okay,
Kim, you want me to read it?
sure. Thank
A
you.
proposal constitutional amendment to allow money from oil and gas mining on state-owned lands to continue to be collected in state funds for land protection and creation and maintenance of parks, nature areas, and public recreation facilities, and to describe how money in those funds can be spent.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So since Sleeping Bear is a federal park, we try to stay out of state politics, but there is a very similar federal act that was just signed by President Trump a month and a half ago, the Great American Outdoors Act, which takes land water conservation funds of oil and gas revenues that the United States government collects. And they have allocated $1.5 billion with a B dollars a year for 5 years to national park deferred maintenance projects. So Sleeping Bear Dunes at National Lakeshore, we have a deferred maintenance project of about $18 million. So if you gave me $18 million today, I have 369 buildings that could use that work, as well as water systems, electrical systems, you name it. We have deferred maintenance. My understanding is that state bill is very similar to try to pull a funding line for state properties as well. Honestly, I don't have an opinion on it. I don't know enough about the state bill that is being considered right now. I do know that national parks and state parks are always a tricky line when you say this is public land, public access, but you have to pay a fee to come and use it to maintain it. I will tell you, Sleeping Bear Dunes, my federal budget is just over $4 million, $4.2 million. In the end, with all other projects, approximately $10 million gets spent we spend about $10 million here in the Lakeshore. We collect about $3.5 million. This year, with COVID response, waiving of fees, we are going to see a deficit of $2 million in the fees that we collect in Sleeping Bear, which will have impacts on the 2021 season, because those are dollars that we spend on rangers, on janitors, on infrastructure here in the park that have a direct connection with the public. So my guess is the state conversation is along those same lines of how to sustainably fund state parks and public lands in the state of Michigan while not tapping tax dollars.
Okay, Scott, this is Paul Trapp. It's 10:30, and so those of you who have to leave are free to leave. We want to take a moment to thank you so very much for this presentation, this informative presentation. We know that you'll be around for another 15 minutes or so to answer questions for any hangers on. I don't think we can close this session about the national parks without a tie to the local history in the national parks. As everyone knows, the first national park was Yellowstone, but the second national park was instituted by a senator from Grand Haven, Thomas White Ferry, who helped create Mackinac Island National Park, which has the distinction too of being the first national park to be deaccessioned. So we do have a tie, long-running tie with the National Park Service. But we thank you so very much for your presentation today, and there'll be a few more questions if you have time. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. All right, Scott, I have a couple of sort of, I guess, park-specific questions. One is whether or not there's a place for volunteers to stay at the park. And another is sort of just a general question about, since park ranger work is often seasonal, how job security is for park rangers.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll hit the first one first, volunteers. So there's a couple ways that volunteers stay in the park. So we have a large contingent of mobile volunteers that are, they live in their RV and they travel the country, and they actually go park to park to park or public land spot to spot. They have their calendar a year in advance, and so the requirement, we will provide a parking spot for that, we will provide their camping spot for 32 hours a week of service. And so that's one way of how volunteers can stay in a park. The second piece is within park housing. Tricky answer. Sleeping Bear, we have approximately 75 beds in park housing. And so those are filled by seasonal rangers as well as volunteers and interns. This summer, as we responded to COVID, we went from 75 beds to 20 beds. And so we limited the number of beds that we offered this year, and hopefully we'll see how things change in the future. So there's a couple options for some park housing in Sleeping Bear. Parks across the country, every park is different. If you are in a park like a Yellowstone or parks that have in the middle of nowhere, there's better opportunities in the park. As for job security, it is a tricky piece. I actually have a maintenance worker who has worked as a seasonal park ranger at Sleeping Bear for 28 years, who will be retiring next Thursday. By OPM standards, Office of Personnel Management, we are a federal bureaucracy. A seasonal employee cannot work more than 1,039 hours in a calendar year. So that is literally 1 hour short of 6 months. And so seasonal employees do one of two things. They line up a summer season and a winter season. So they might work a summer in Sleeping Bear and they might work a winter in Everglades, where parks shift where their busy seasons are. And park funding traditionally hits when their tourism season is. So I have funding that brings on approximately 100 employees in the summer when I need them most. I don't have enough work for them in the winter. So it's a tricky piece. If some folks only want to work 6 months a year or 4 months of the year, my career would have gone completely left. When I was a seasonal in the summer in Alaska, I actually received a job offer from Hawaii Volcanoes for a winter season. And I was 23. What better life than summers in Alaska, winters in Hawaii? And I got two job offers. I got a job offer for a seasonal in Hawaii and a term, which meant a 4-year guarantee in Washington, D.C. And I guess I was smart. I took the 4-year guarantee. Otherwise, I was in Hawaii today. But it's a tricky piece. Job announcements for next summer across the country just came out yesterday for many of the summer jobs for the 2021 season. So if you're a seasonal employee, you spend a lot of time. The second you get a job, you start looking for the next one.
Where do you look at those?
They're all federal jobs, so they are on usajobs.gov.
Okay. And then I think maybe the last question that I'm seeing is, what larger wild animals live in Sleeping Bear, specifically large, quote, cats?
Good question. So large cats, the largest cat that is documented are bobcats or lynxes within Sleeping Bear. We do have a black bear population. There's always the question of cougars. In my time here, there's been a couple of reported visual sightings of mountain lions making their way through the park. There has not been any documentation of a breeding population. I want to say 2012, there were a couple of visual sightings. The park put out a couple of traps of deer carcasses that were never touched. So there's no photo evidence of any large cats in Sleeping Bear. But I'll tell you, my boat captain, who's been here for 40 years, knows he almost hit one last summer as he was driving through the Lakeshore. I trust him with my life on the Great Lakes, so I'll trust that report as well.
Thank you. Any forecast for lake water levels in the coming year yet?
What I saw from Army Corps of Engineer, it's going to drop. We're now in that little drop, but next summer should be right up there. And the precipitation expected this winter, it sounds like it's going to be cold and wet, so it's going to continue that cycle. It looks like into 2021.
Okay, thank you so much. That's all I have, Claudia, that I can see in the chat. I have a personal question. I'm just wondering if I'm assuming you must work pretty closely with Leelanau Conservancy Group.
We do.
And how is it decided what land is Leelanau Conservancy protected versus, state or federal protected?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So when Sleeping Bear was created in 1970, Congress drew on a map our legislative boundary. So we can talk for hours on land acquisition, but within that that gives the U.S. government authority to purchase land within that legislative boundary. Back in the 70s, it was pretty intense. There were properties that were identified as critical to preserving the story of Sleeping Bear, all the stories we just talked about. And so some of those lands were condemned and forcibly sold. Others were categorized as second level, which said, these lands would be great. You can sell to us. If you choose not to sell to the government, then there will be an attachment to your deed that says forever, you cannot change the use of this property, and you cannot change, and you can't, it pretty much says you need to ask the park if you want to do anything to the property, cut down any trees, and change the natural environment. And so if you chose not to sell to the park back in the 70s, that was attached to your deed. Still today, it's a limit of use of the property. So one of our challenges, somebody that may have kept their cottage from 1978, they cannot change their use, which means they cannot use it as an Airbnb, because in 1970 it was a cottage. Therefore, they cannot rent it out as an Airbnb. There are several properties that were rental cottages in the 70s. Those are still allowed to be rental cottages today because they could not, because their use was that in 1970.
At that time, okay.
At that time. And so that was another option. The third option is you could have sold your property to the government and for the market value, and then remained on your property for a reservation of use. And that reservation of use could have been 10 years, 20 years, or a lifetime. And so you could have said, but I'm going to sell it to you, and I want to stay here for 10 years. And so the simplified version is the government took 10%, 1% for every year off of your sale price. And then you live tax-free on that property for 10 years. Or you did a reservation of use, which was a life estate, and you live on that property until you pass. And then when you pass, it comes back, it comes in public domain. And they use life expectancies, for what the percentage that came off. So those are within the legislative boundary. So to get to the question about Leelanau Conservancy, if we have a landowner who's a willing seller, and that's the only thing we'll take right now. I sent out a letter to all 100 landowners that had property within the Lakeshore spring break of last year and said, hey, we have some money appropriated by Congress for land acquisition. Are you interested? And I had 20 people respond saying, yeah, come give us an appraisal. Tell us what you'll give us. My guess is maybe 5 of those were thinking they might sell to the government. They don't have to sell to us. They can sell to anybody. They can say, there's no way I'm going to sell to the government. I will sell it to Bill for $3 before I sell it to the government. And that's okay. Because we're in the forever business, and if we might purchase it and protect it 50 years from now. Leelanau Conservancy, if we come across some properties that we don't have federal allocations for, we will work with them, and they may vote within their conservancy to purchase a property within the Lakeshore, and then knowingly hold it until we get appropriations to buy it from them. Leelanau Conservancy just purchased property right along our boundary outside the park, which we cannot legally purchase. And then they hold it as conservancy land. So Grand Traverse Conservancy is currently working a land deal in the southern part of the park, and that landowner owns, I'm going to go ballpark numbers, like 300 acres. And of that 300 acres, 100 is within our park boundary, 200 is outside the boundary. So the Grand Traverse Conservancy is raising the funds to buy all 300 acres, and then we will buy fair market value of the 100 acres that are within the Lakeshore.
Okay, thank
That
you.
makes
That's
sense.
helpful. We'll check the chat box. I think everything else has been addressed. Does anyone else have any other questions for Scott? We're good. Oh, somebody had a sort of a personal question that they were a scout leader and spent some time working at Sleeping Bear Dunes during spring cleanup for several years, and they're wondering if Ranger Jim Del Sasso is still in the area.
He is still in the area. He retired before I arrived. I think he retired in early 2012-ish, 13-ish maybe.
Okay.
He is still in the area, yes.
Neat. Okay, and then there's a comment that we would love a HASP trip to Sleeping Bear for the day. So we will make note of that when we can travel together once again on a bus in close contact with one another.
Exactly, definitely. Let me know if that happens.
Yes. Great. Okay, it's almost 10:45, so we asked him for an extra 15 minutes, and he has graciously given that to us. Thank you so much. This was awesome. Such a beautiful area, and we appreciate you sharing the history of it with us. Thank you so much.
Great, everybody. You're always welcome. Come up and enjoy.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Have a wonderful day, everyone. Good to
Thank you.
see you. Take care. Bye-bye.